So today, Judge Chutkan released the new presidential immunity motion that Jack Smith filed. So if you remember, right, in 2020, there were allegations that President Trump attempted to steal the 2020 election, right? And so that process has been ongoing. And earlier we got some indictments, which means that one of our federal prosecutors at the Department of Justice filed a motion and spoke to a grand jury and got an indictment. They said there's enough evidence here for you to move forward and bring a case against this person. Welcome, welcome. We're just getting started. I'm going to be going through the new presidential immunity doc. It's 165 pages. At first, I wanted to exactly Weird Facts Elvis, the so what at the end, to Donald Trump being alerted that the Secret Service was moving Vice President Pence into a safe house because he was in danger, and he was literally just like, so what? There are a lot of shocking details in here. Like Jack Smith is coming through with like facts, emails, receipts, timelines, okay? And so what I'm going to be doing tonight is going through this document. So I'm an attorney, and I understand that sometimes these documents are a little bit esoteric and difficult to understand. And so I'm gonna do my best to demystify this as we go through. If you have any questions, I'll do my best to answer those. Anybody else who has any legal expertise, I would love for you to join me and chat about this. But so I'm just going to start out from the top. As you know, so the way that this started in 2020, there were allegations that President Trump attempted to do things in partnership with others, so a conspiracy to subvert the results of the 2020 election. And the DOJ has been working on this for a long time. They did a lot of research, did some discovery, clearly got some firsthand sources. We are talking about texts between people on the campaign, conversations between campaign officials and Donald Trump that really make it clear, like smoking pew level, that there was a knowing attempt to subvert the 2020 election, knowing that the information that they were saying in front of cameras and over again was false. And so I have with me a list of all of the people who are named, but their names have been redacted, which just means covered up in the document, so you aren't able to read them, so we don't expose those people. As we go through, I'll do my best not to talk about civilians, right? But I will be naming folks like Rudy Giuliani, who's listed as co-conspirator number one. So we will be going through that. But basically, here's the background of what's going on. So the DOJ, Jack Smith, attorney, okay, extraordinaire, got a grand jury indictment, right? But that first one went all the way up to the Supreme Court because Trump's team was arguing, actually, you can't even hold me accountable for none of this because I was president and I'm immune, right? So that went all the way up to the top. We know, based on some the Washington Post reporting, that they looked at some memos from Chief Justice Roberts, the sort of head justice of the Supreme Court, and revealed that way before they even heard this case, they had decided that they were going to grant him presidential immunity. And so what that immunity case meant was you can't charge a former or sitting president with any sort of crime if what they are doing is in like an official act, like an executive power, okay? And so they said, which is so ironic now that this has come out, but they were basically like, no, you need to go back and show some proof, show us what your evidence is, and be able to demonstrate that these things are not inside of a president's official powers, something like executive power that's official to the president, so they can be able to use that, all right? So Jack Smith said, bet. and went through all of his evidence, took out the things that might be construed as inside of a president's official powers, and then came back to another grand jury, got another indictment, and now he's in front of Judge Chutkan again. All right. And so basically, as part of this process to deal with or to meet the standard that the Supreme Court set, Jack Smith has to produce evidence that says, hey, I've got enough here. There's enough meat on the bone that doesn't involve any of his official powers that we can move forward with this case. All right. So that's where we are now. So this 165-page document is basically Jack Smith putting it all on the table, right? He's like, you want to see facts? You want to see evidence? I got you. Okay. Facts, emails, receipts, timelines. It's all here. Okay. So we're going to start with that right at the top, because the first page of this document it's stunning. And I gotta say this, as an attorney who has spent time reading a lot of motions and briefs, they can often get very boring. And I will say that Jack Smith and his team did a great job of making this like a clear narrative. If you want to read along with me, I'll give you page stamps as we go. But I just found the document online. You can easily just look up United States versus Donald Trump. Put in Jack Smith. I'm sure it'll come up and you'll be able to download it. All right. But basically, this is the motion for the judge to be able to determine if the acts that they are claiming are criminal are official acts or not. And so the way that Jack Smith is going about this is their argument is that the acts that they're talking about and the things that Trump did, where he was doing those as a candidate, as a citizen running for president, someone running for office, not someone actually who holds office, right? So that's what was going on. So he's going to do a lot of talking about Trump as a candidate. And all throughout here, Donald Trump is going to be referred to as the defendant because he's the person who is being charged with these crimes. And the crime is basically criminal conspiracy. All right, let's get started. Page 1. The defendant asserts that he is immune from prosecution for his criminal scheme to overturn the 2020 presidential election because he claims it entailed official conduct. All right, remember what I was saying just before, right, about that distinction between a president doing something within their official powers, right, as the president, as the leader of the free world, versus as just a normal person, right, who's running for office or seeking office. Right. So Jack continues, not so. Although the defendant was the incumbent president during the charged conspiracies, his scheme was fundamentally a private one. Working with a team of private co-conspirators, the defendant acted as a candidate when he pursued multiple criminal means to disrupt, through fraud and deceit, the government function by which votes are collected and counted, a function in which the defendant, as president, had no official role. I'm going to pause here. This is still just like the third sentence of the first page. And so what they're doing in this first page is really outlining, giving you an overview of what the entire document is going to say, right? And this is such a critical piece of this, right? Because again, the Supreme Court essentially said, you can't charge the president with anything if that is within their official role, right? And so Jack Smith is laying out here, and the DOJ is laying out here, that the government function by which we are collecting and counting votes, the president has absolutely no official role in that. There is nothing inside of the Constitution that says that it is a part of the president's official duties to be involved in anything around collecting and counting votes. Okay? So that's critical. He continues. In Trump v. United States, which is the court case that went all the way up to the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court said he would have immunity for official acts, the Supreme Court held that presidents are immune from prosecution for certain official conduct, including the defendant's use of the Justice Department in furtherance of his scheme, as was alleged in the original indictment. I'm going to pause here. So this is where he's talking about essentially the Supreme Court was like, all of that juicy, incredible evidence that you have that Trump actually tried to use an arm of the government, an arm of the Justice Department to actually further the scheme of overturning the 2020 election. We can't use any of that because the president instructing the department, the Justice Department, to do things is a part of an official act, right? So none of that is going to be included in this motion, right? So again, the Supreme Court held that presidents are immune from prosecution for certain official conduct, including the defendant's use of the Justice Department in furtherance of his scheme, as was alleged in the original indictment, and remanded to this court to determine whether the remaining allegations against the defendant are immunized. And remanded to this court to determine whether the remaining allegations against the defendant are immunized. Now, my little sister trying to FaceTime me so she can get my Amazon password. But so remanded is just a legal word that says we sent it back down to the previous court that made the decision, right? So the Supreme Court was like, we've decided you can't include any of this. You need to send this back to the court before this, and they need to, quote, determine whether the remaining allegations against the defendant are immunized, right? Whether the rest of the claims that don't involve the president using the Justice Department to overturn the election, whether those are official acts that can be immune. Jack then continues and he says, the answer to that question is no. This motion provides a comprehensive account of the defendant's private criminal conduct that sets forth the legal framework created by Trump, the case that went up to the Supreme Court, for resolving immunity claims. It applies that framework to establish that none of the defendant's charged conduct is immunized because it either was unofficial or any presumptive immunity is rebutted, and request the relief the government seeks, which is at bottom this: that the court determined that the defendant must stand trial for his private crimes as would any other citizen. Now, this is big, right? Because basically this motion and the question that is before the court is if Donald Trump can be tried for the criminal conspiracy to overturn the 2020 election. Right? And so he's outlining here that first, what we're going to do is we're going to lay out the evidence, right? There's going to be a comprehensive account. I've read now up to like 60 pages of this 165 page document, and I'm still not through just the evidence that they're putting forward. After they put forward the evidence then in this document, they explain then why the Supreme Court's ruling doesn't apply here, why the evidence that's included here is not an official act, and why he's not immune from the specific claims in here, right? And then there's this tricky legal term that talks about rebutted, right? So let's see. It applies the framework to establish that none of the defendant's charged conduct is immunized because it was either unofficial, as in not an official act as president, he was just a regular citizen running for office, or any presumptive immunity is rebutted, right? So there can be a rebuttal wherein you can argue, yeah, sure, it was an official act, but if we say that these kinds of things are immune, that would actually be dangerous to our democracy and is not something that would be constitutionally protected. All right, so let's get into it. Then it says, okay, so now they're talking about the relief that the government seeks, and they say, which is at bottom this: that the court determined that the defendant must stand trial for his private crimes as would any other citizen, right? So they're like, listen, he got to go to prison for this, right? We got to try him. It's wild. And as we go through this, you'll see like it is shocking, some of the things that were done and said. And as just a note, I know there are documentaries out, right, on stopping the steal. We had the J6 committee and they did a lot of unveiling of evidence. But, oh, Vex, that's not how you spell acquitted. Bless your heart. Okay, so, But it's different when the DOJ and a prosecutor are able to do what's called discovery, and they can actually demand documents from people, right? They can go much further. So when the J6 committee in Congress was doing interviews, right, they could basically only ask really that people come. And so they asked Mike Pence to come and testify there, but he was basically like, no, you can't make me. I have executive privilege. That does not apply to this, right? To when you have a prosecutor at the DOJ doing discovery. So there's lots of incredibly incriminating stuff in here where Mike Pence has basically given a deposition, right, to Jack Smith and essentially been like, this is what happened, this is what he said. So now we have details from conversations between Mike Pence and Donald Trump. And interestingly, it's going to be those conversations between the two of them where there's going to be further battle in the court, where they're discussing whether or not those are official acts, right? Because there's an argument that the president in his executive capacity is talking to the vice president in his executive capacity, and that's an official act and it doesn't apply. But the rest of this, okay, the stuff with Rudy Giuliani, the stuff with his campaign people, the stuff that's going to come out, it's wild. Okay. Enough of that. I'll continue reading. So now I'm at the top of page 2. For those of you who are just joining me, we are going through the new 160-page document that was just unsealed by the court that Jack Smith, who is the Department of Justice prosecutor, right, who is attempting to prosecute Donald Trump for attempting to overturn the 2020 election. And remember, the Supreme Court was like, you can't charge him for things that he's immune for, all of those official acts. And so this is Jack Smith's offer of proof to say, I have evidence that are not official acts, that are crimes that he needs to be held accountable for. All right. Yes. Lonnie, go Jack Smith. He is really doing this. All right. So top of page 2. Here we go. This motion provides the framework for conducting the necessarily fact-bound immunity analysis required by the Supreme Court's remand order. It proceeds in 4 parts. Now, this is so interesting, and I really wonder, because Kavanaugh and all of those justices who were like, yeah, you need to send this back down and get some facts, they've got to be just mortified, because essentially the Supreme Court demanded this. Right? Jack Smith has to produce this evidence because the Supreme Court said, no, you need to show us some facts, right? That the things that he did are not a part of his official acts. So they were basically like, pics where it didn't happen. And Jack Smith was like, I got a whole roll. Okay. So I won't read all the detail of them just describing what the 4 parts are going to be about, but I'll give you just the overview, right? So section 1, it's just a detailed statement of what the government intends to prove at trial. So this is them laying out all of the allegations and all the specifics, and they're like, he did this, okay? So that's going to be all of the facts, all of the evidence there. Section 2 then talks about the legal principles that govern the claims of presidential immunity. And that's when they're really going to get into, all those legal details that the Supreme Court set out and the standard that they created when they were like, just out of whole cloth, brand new, presidents are immune for official acts, right? So they basically created a new legal standard that Jack then has to apply and prove that his evidence overcomes, right? Then in section 3, Jack is like, we're going to apply those legal principles to the defendant's conduct and establish that nothing the government intends to present to the jury is protected by presidential immunity. So he's like, we're ready to prove it, baby. Okay, we got it. Then finally, section 4 explains the relief that is sought by the government and specifies the findings that the court should make in a single order. Quote, namely, that the defendant's conduct set forth in section 1, the beginning, where they're going to explain all the evidence, is not immunized, and that as a result, the defendant must stand trial on the superseding indictment, and the government is not prohibited at trial from using evidence of the conduct described in section 1. All right. So again, this is basically them saying, we are arguing now that the evidence herein that we have collected means that he needs to stand trial. Okay, he needs to come to court every day. We're going to put this evidence on. We're going to bring witnesses. You're going to actually hear from these people. And all of that is allowed, and it is not barred by the Supreme Court decision, right? So basically, he's like, Trump needs to go to prison. All right, now let's get into the good part, okay? This is like the middle of page 3, and it's the section that's titled Factual Proffer. And what this basically means when they ask for like a proffer of evidence, it's like, you got to show me some proof. What you got? You say you've got evidence that that it does not fall into presidential immunity, right? And they're like, show me. And Jack's like, okay, here it is. All right. This first paragraph is like wild. Here we go. When the defendant lost the 2020 presidential election, he resorted to crimes to try to stay in office. With private co-conspirators, the defendant launched a series of increasingly desperate plans to overturn the legitimate election results in 7 states that he had lost: Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, New Mexico, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, that here throughout will be referred to as targeted states. His efforts included lying to state officials in order to induce them to ignore true vote counts, manufacturing fraudulent electoral votes in the targeted states, attempting to enlist Vice President Michael R. Pence in his role as President of the Senate to obstruct Congress's certification of the election by using the defendant's fraudulent electoral votes, and when all else had failed, on January 6th, 2021, directing an angry crowd of supporters to the United States Capitol to obstruct the congressional certification. Now let's take these bits piece by piece, right? So first they say, we're going to talk about his efforts included lying to state officials in order to induce them to ignore true vote counts. These are those instances where we've got those recordings of him calling, right, the governor and the secretary of state in Georgia being like, all I need is 11,780 votes. Can you just find me those votes? Can you just do that, right? That is the type of behavior that they're talking about there. Then the next thing, manufacturing fraudulent electoral votes in the targeted states. Now, here's the key thing, right? The Electoral College is very complicated, but to keep it super simple, basically each state has their own amount of electors, right? So what is it? Pennsylvania has like 19 electors, right? But the way that this works is that there is a different slate of electors for each candidate, right? So the Democrats will hold a little local election for people who want to be electors, and those people will be electors for Biden, and they will be slated if he wins that state. Now, that state will also, and the Republican Party will run a small local election for their electors, right? Should Trump win, right? So you've got 2 groups of electors. And whichever way the state goes, whoever wins the popular vote in that state, they get all the electors, right? So in this case with like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, Nevada, because Biden won all of those electors that were his, the Democratic electors that got elected, those are the duly elected electors, right? But they are claiming, and there's detail in here, that Donald Trump and his campaign tried to get the people who were elected for him as electors, right, who are no longer involved because he did not win the popular vote in those states, to try and meet and certify themselves as the electors and make a list with their names on it that they would then send to Congress and have Mike Pence as the vice president say that those are the official electors instead of Joe Biden's electors, right? So that's just a complicated way of saying they were trying to do a bait and switch, right? There's a list of electors that were for Biden. He won the state. He should get them. And what Trump and his campaign were trying to do is take their list and pass it off as the real one, right? Then the third thing, attempting to enlist Vice President Michael R. Pence in his role as president of the Senate to obstruct the Congress's certification of the election by using the defendant's fraudulent electoral votes, right? So that's where on January 6th, right, Vice President, it is their job to certify the election. They're just supposed to gavel it, right, and be like, I hereby certify, right? Now, this is so critical because here, notice they mention the vice president in his role as president of the Senate. That's going to be critical because president of the Senate is not an executive position, right? It's not an executive role. And so in that role, what that means, the reason that they're talking about that is because they're trying to make the argument that this is not official conduct. Because the vice president, as president of the Senate, when he was just supposed to be in Congress gaveling, right? That don't have nothing to do with his like official executive acts. And so the president trying to get him to do something different there is not a part of an official act, right? Okay. Then lastly, to obstruct Congress's certification of the election. And then last, it says, when all else failed, when none of that worked, then he, on January 6th, directed an angry crowd of supporters to the United States Capitol to obstruct the congressional certification. And that's what we all saw on our television with the mob attacking the Capitol, breaking in. Someone lost their life. You know, they were running around, putting up gallows to try and do harm to Mike Pence. So that's a lot. Those are just the first 3 sentences of the factual proffer. Okay. Next, the through line of these efforts was deceit. The defendants and co-conspirators knowingly false claims of election fraud. Okay. They're going to prove to you that these people who were saying that the election was stolen, that he lost, they knew at the time that it was false, and they said it anyway as part of a conspiracy to overturn the election, okay? They used these lies in a furtherance of 3 conspiracies. 1, a conspiracy to interfere with the federal government function by which the nation collects and counts election results, which is set forth in the Constitution and the Electoral Count Act. Okay, here, Jack is basically like, listen, the Constitution and our acts around this are super clear, right? And Trump and his conspiracy tried to interfere with that, right? They tried to subvert that. The second conspiracy that Jack claims, a conspiracy to obstruct the official proceeding in which Congress certifies the legitimate results of the presidential election. That's when they're talking about January 6th, right? The third conspiracy, a conspiracy against the rights of millions of Americans to vote and have their votes counted. And this is so critical. This is the core of it, right? We're basically, by trying to strong arm state election officials into falsifying election results, in the acts of trying to submit a list of fake electors and force the vice president to certify those instead of the real ones, what that would have done if he had gone through with that was it would absolutely vitiate, wipe out, make meaningless the votes of all of us as American citizens, right? Not just the people in the swing states, right, that were contested, but every single vote that was cast, right? All right, let's continue. We're on the top of page 4. For everybody who's just coming in, I am reading through the new unsealed 165-page motion that Jack Smith produced around presidential immunity, where he lays out all of the factual evidence that shows that, or that he's going to argue in court, or is asking to be able to argue in court, that President Trump did in order to overturn the 2020 election. And we're just in the intro where he's laying out the facts, okay? All right, at its core, the defendant's scheme was a private criminal effort. Remember, this is important because they're trying to make the argument that these acts are not a part of presidential immunity. In his capacity as a candidate, the defendant used deceit to target every stage of the electoral process, which through the Constitution, the Electoral College Act, and state laws includes the state's notification to the federal government of the selection of their representative electors based on the popular vote in that state, the meeting of those electors to cast their votes consistent with the popular vote, and Congress's counting of the electors' votes at a certification proceeding. Remember, this is what I was talking about earlier, right? So first, each state has to notify the federal government, hey, we've got our list of electors, we've certified our election, this is the slate of electors that we'll send to the federal government. Trump tried to subvert that. There's evidence in here of that. Then those electors actually have to meet themselves to certify their votes or cast their votes consistent with the popular vote. There is evidence in here of how Rudy Giuliani and other campaign folks under the direction of Donald Trump had or lied to the electors, the Republican electors, and told them, hey, you need to come down here and we're just going to do a vote. It's just in case, the litigation that we have in place goes Trump's way, and we just want to make sure that we have, it's certified and we have your votes just in case. All of that is a lie, right? They were lying to those people. There's also evidence in here that some folks, more sophisticated actors, right? Like people who were electors who had previously been members of the United States Congress or who were U.S. attorneys were like, what are you talking about? That feels illegal. I'm not going to do that. Right? So those are the types of things that they're talking about with that piece of this, where they're talking about the meeting of those electors to cast their votes consistent with the popular vote. And then lastly, remember, January 6th, Congress's counting of the electors' votes at a certification proceeding, right? All of that is illegal, okay? So let's continue. As set forth in detail below, the defendant worked with private co-conspirators, including private attorneys. Now, there's some names here that are redacted, but a really smart individual on the internet spent some time and went through because, it's not hard to figure out who these people are, right? But their names are redacted just as part of the legal process to be able to make these documents public. But I'm going to be naming public figures, but I'm not going to name any private citizens, like any of the people that Rudy Giuliani and Trump tried to accuse of falsifying documents, like the private citizens who are poll workers who have already had their lives threatened. I'm not going to name those people here. But let's get back into it. So as set forth in detail below, the defendant worked with private co-conspirators, including private attorneys. CC1, CC stands for co-conspirator. That person is Rudy Giuliani. Co-conspirator 2 is John Eastman, who is one of Trump's lawyers. Co-conspirator 3 is Sidney Powell, who is another one of Trump's lawyers. Then we had co-conspirator 5, who is Kenneth Chesborough, who drafted fake elector memos, right? So remember when I was talking about earlier, the electors and the people who are elected to cast their votes in the Electoral College, right? This guy, Kenneth Chesborough, co-conspirator number 5, was the one who was actually drafting memos that they have and that they reference here with quotes. Okay, it's wild. And private political operatives, co-conspirator number 6, named Christina Bobb, and P1, who is listed as Steve Bannon. And Steve Bannon already in jail for the things that he did. My God. All right. The defendant also relied heavily on private agents, such as his campaign employees and volunteers, like campaign manager P2, whose name is Bill Stepien, deputy campaign manager, who is P3, whose name is Justin Clark, and then senior campaign advisor, who's listed in this document as P4, that's Jason Miller, and then campaign operative listed as P5, which is Michael Roman. All right. So in this section, the government sets forth detailed facts supporting the charges against the defendant. Before addressing in the next section why none of this conduct is subject to immunity under the Supreme Court's decision in Trump, notice there's like a legal shorthand here where we refer to prior cases. They're italicized and it's just the first name in the previous case, right? So for instance, the way people refer to Roe v. Wade, right? If you were to see that written in a legal document, it would just be referred to as Roe and it would be italicized. So in here, if you're reading along with me, again, you can just Google presidential immunity unsealed document Jack Smith. It should come right up. You should be able to download that. I'm on page 4. But if you're in this document and you see Trump italicized, that's their reference to the Supreme Court case that said that the presidents are just immune for official acts. Okay. So again, in this section, the government sets forth detailed facts supporting the charges against the defendant before addressing in the next section why none of this conduct is subject to immunity under the Supreme Court's decision in the Trump case. The conduct set forth below includes the defendant's formation of the conspiracies leading up to and immediately following the 2020 presidential election. Notice this is going to start before the election even happens, right? Because his claims beforehand that we're already hearing now, where he's like, I don't know if we can trust the election. I don't trust it. It seems like it's going to be fraud. All of that is also included in here as part of the long-term conspiracy to try and sow doubt in the legitimacy of the 2020 election. All right. So where are we? Got it. Certain information regarding his knowledge that there had not been outcome determinative fraud in the election as he persistently claimed, and his increasingly desperate efforts to use knowingly false claims of election fraud to disrupt the electoral process. Notice here, they're going to be really clear, right, that there was no fraud that is outcome determinative. Now, this is important, right, because the claims that Trump and his team were making, right, that like 10,000 people who had already passed away were voting, and there were hundreds of thousands of non-citizens who were voting, right, like, no. Right? But because they made those claims, investigations were made, right? And we'll see as we go through, there are like a couple of examples of like small things, like maybe there were 2 people who passed away who voted, right? But that is not enough to determine the outcome of the election. It's not going to overturn it. And so that's why they're going to use that term outcome determinative fraud, right? So again, let's read this because it's juicy. The conduct set forth below includes the defendant's formation of the conspiracies leading up to and immediately following the 2020 presidential election. Certain information regarding his knowledge that there had not been outcome determinative fraud in the election, as he persistently claimed and is still claiming, and his increasingly desperate efforts to use knowingly false claims of election fraud to disrupt the electoral process. The government does not consider any of the following conduct to be subject to immunity for reasons set forth in Section 3. Wow, you guys. Let's just pause here because I know we are tired of living through like unprecedented times. But to see in writing a document that is essentially saying the government is prosecuting a prior president for crimes, it's sad and it's unfortunate that Donald Trump has been allowed to do this. And as we go through, it doesn't make any sense that he's even still allowed to be running for president, given the things that are in here. All right. Let's get into the section. It's titled Formation of the Conspiracies. So this is where Jack is going to lay out his evidence of how Trump started these conspiracies. Okay, we're at the top of page 5 for people who are following along. All right. Although his multiple conspiracies began after Election Day in 2020, the defendant laid the groundwork for his crimes well before then. Remember, the defendant here is Donald Trump. Leading into the election, the defendant's private and campaign advisors, including P6, whose name was that again? Oh, Roger Stone. already in prison. Okay. Including Roger Stone, then a private citizen, and P2, who is Bill Stepien, who's the defendant's campaign manager, informed him that it would be a close contest and that it was unlikely to be finalized on election day, in part because of the time needed to process large numbers of mail-in ballots prompted by the COVID-19 pandemic. If you'll remember, back in 2020 when this was happening, right? Like, we were in the middle of a pandemic. And so people weren't going to go out to the polls as much. And so there was a lot of mail-in balloting. They also told the defendant that the initial returns on election night, so the initial counts of those votes, might be misleading. That is, that he might take an early lead in the vote count that would diminish as mail-in ballots were counted because his own supporters favored in-person voting, while supporters of his opponent, Joseph R. Biden, favored mail-in ballots. So what they're basically saying is even before the election happened, right, you had Roger Stone and Bill Stepien talking to Donald Trump, and they were like, listen, okay, on election night, when these results start coming in, it's going to look at the beginning like you're ahead because they're going to be like counting those live votes as they come in. But we know that there's going to be a crap ton of mail-in ballots from all of these Democrats who believed that COVID was real, who were abiding by the restrictions and didn't want to be out within 6 feet of people. So they decided to turn in their mail-in ballots, right? And so mail-in ballots are usually counted later in the night. And sometimes it takes a couple of days after election to do that. So basically they're looking at him and they're like, on election night, it might look like you're winning because they're just counting, right, votes that are likely yours. But later when they start counting those mail-in ballots, he's going to start creeping up on you and it might not go your way. Okay, let's get back to reading. Privately, the defendant, Donald Trump, told his advisors, including P6, Roger Stone, campaign personnel P7, who is Mark Meadows. Let me get this set up here so I can easily go back and forth. All right. Privately, the defendant told advisors, including Roger Stone, campaign personnel Mark Meadows, a White House staffer and a campaign volunteer, and someone who's listed as P8, which is Mark Short, who is the vice president's chief of staff, that in such a scenario, okay, in the scenario where they're counting the live in-person votes on election day and it's looking like Trump is ahead, but then they start counting the mail-in ballots and Joe Biden starts to creep up on him and it looks like he might overtake him. In that scenario, he would simply declare victory before all the ballots were counted and any winner was projected. Now, it's important to note all of these sentences have footnotes. Okay. And they point you to a spot at the bottom where Jack Smith is like saying, I have an exhibit for this. I have evidence for this. It will be an email. It will be a text message. It will be a tweet. It will be direct first person reports of a conversation, right? So all of this is evidenced. Okay. Everything he's saying. Then publicly, the defendant began to plant the seeds for that false declaration. In the months leading up to the election, he refused to say whether he would accept the election results, insisted that he could lose the election only because of fraud, falsely claimed that mail-in ballots were inherently fraudulent, and asserted that only votes counted by election day were valid. Then Jack says, for instance, okay, and then we get this huge list of like examples. So first, in an interview on July 19, 2020, when asked repeatedly if he would accept the results of the election, the defendant said he would, quote, have to see, and quote, it depends. Next piece of evidence. On July 30th, despite having voted by mail himself earlier that year, the defendant suggested that widespread mail-in voting provided cause for delaying the election. Tweeting. I love that they're referencing his tweets, okay? With universal mail-in voting, not absentee voting, which is good, 2020 will be the most, all caps, inaccurate and fraudulent election in history. It will be a great embarrassment to the USA. Delay the election until people can properly, securely, and safely vote. Question mark, question mark, question mark. Piece of evidence number 3, that he was sowing the idea that the election was going to be fraudulent, and casting doubt on mail-in ballots before the election even happened. It's wild that we even need evidence for this because he's doing it right now in our faces already about the 2024 election. But anyway, piece of evidence number 3. In an interview on August 2nd, the defendant claimed without any basis that, quote, there is no way you can go through a mail-in vote without massive cheating, end quote. Piece of evidence number 4. At a campaign event in Wisconsin on August 17th, the defendant told his supporters, quote, the only way we're going to lose this election is if the election is rigged. Remember that. It's the only way we're going to lose this election, so we have to be very careful, right? Again, evidence that he is sowing doubt about the legitimacy of the election and mail-in ballots before the election even started, right? This is the beginning of that conspiracy. 5th piece of evidence. In his acceptance speech at the Republican National Convention on August 24th, the defendant said that, quote, the only way they can take this election away from us is if this is a rigged election, end quote. Next piece of evidence. On October 27th, during remarks regarding his campaign, the defendant said, quote, it would be very, very proper and very nice if a winner were declared on November 3rd, instead of counting ballots for 2 weeks, which is totally inappropriate. And I don't believe that that's by our laws. I don't believe that. So we'll see what happens, end quote. The defendant said this despite, or perhaps because, that's something that Jack said, okay? The defendant said this despite, or perhaps because, his private advisors had informed him that it was unlikely that the winner of the election would be declared on November 3rd. Now we're at the top of page 7. By October 2020, P1, who is Steve Bannon, a private political advisor who had worked for the defendant's 2016 presidential campaign, began to assist with the defendant's re-election effort. 3 days before Election Day, Steve Bannon described the defendant's plan to a private gathering of supporters. Quote, and what Trump's going to do is just declare victory, right? He's going to declare victory. That doesn't mean he's the winner. He's just going to say he's the winner. Again, there is a footnote after this. Okay, so this is evidenced, right? Again, this is Jack Smith saying, I have evidence of this. We're going to bring this. This is what we intend to prove, right? And we've evidenced this. We've done the discovery. We've got the paperwork, facts, receipts, okay? After explaining that Biden supporters favored voting by mail, Steve Bannon stated further, quote, and so they're going to have a natural disadvantage and Trump's going to take advantage of it. That's our strategy. He's going to declare himself a winner. So they have Steve Bannon on record saying that because of mail-in voting and how those votes are going to come in later, when only just the day of votes are coming in and it looks like Trump is ahead, he's just going to go out and say he won the election, right? And that's their strategy. Just declare yourself the winner. Now we're moving on to the second paragraph on page 7. Immediately following Election Day on November 3rd, the defendant did exactly that. As his private and campaign advisors had predicted to him, in certain states, the defendant took an early lead on Election Day that began to erode. At approximately 11:20 p.m., Fox News projected that Biden would prevail in the state of Arizona. And according to campaign advisor P4, who is Jason Miller, he and the defendant were shocked and angry at this development. Remember, the defendant is Donald Trump. As Election Day turned to November 4th, the contest was too close to project a winner. And in discussions about what the defendant should say publicly regarding the election, senior advisors suggested that the defendant should show restraint while counting continued, right? So there were people in his camp who were like, hold on now, calm down, don't do too much, okay? 2 private advisors, however, advocated a different course. Co-conspirator number 1, Rudy Giuliani, and co-conspirator number 6, Christina Bobb, suggested that the defendant just declare victory. Again, there's a footnote after this, and a lot of the footnotes are redacted, but that lets us know they have this evidenced, okay? And there will be an exhibit that they plan to bring at court to show this. And at about 2:20 a.m., the defendant gave televised remarks to a crowd of his campaign supporters in which he falsely claimed, without evidence or specificity, that there had been fraud in the election and that he had won. Quote, "This is a fraud on the American public. This is an embarrassment to our country. We were getting ready to win this election. Frankly, we did win this election. We did win this election." If you want to actually see the video of him saying that, you can feel free to Google it. I'm sure if you just Google like his 2020 election night speech, it'll come up. But also, if you would like, the documentary on HBO called Stopping the Steal also has a lot of these videos. All right, so we continue. In the immediate post-election period, while the defendant claimed fraud without proof, his private operatives sought to create chaos rather than seek clarity at polling places where states were continuing to tabulate votes. For example, on November 4th, P5, who is Michael Roman, a campaign employee, agent, and co-conspirator of the defendant, tried to sow confusion when the ongoing vote count at the TCF Center in Detroit, Michigan, looked unfavorable for the defendant. There, when a colleague at the TCF Center told P5, who is Michael Roman, quote, "We think a batch of votes heavily in Biden's favor is right." What's his name again? Michael Roman responded, "Find a reason it isn't," quote. Quote, "Give me options to file litigation," end quote. And quote, "even if it's BS." Okay? They have these documents. All of these are footnoted and quoted, okay? When the colleague suggested that there was about to be unrest reminiscent of the Brooks Brothers riot, a violent effort to stop the vote count in Florida after the 2020 presidential election, P5 responded, "Make them riot. Do it." Shocking stuff. The defendant's campaign operatives and supporters used similar tactics at other tabulation centers, including in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And the defendant sometimes used the resulting confrontations to falsely claim that his election observers were being denied proper access, thus serving as a predicate to the defendant's claim that fraud must have occurred in the observer's absence, right? So what this basically means is that Donald Trump is sending his campaign operatives down to these places where they're counting mail-in votes that are coming in that are obviously not going in Donald Trump's favor, right? And those people are going in being like, "Hey, you need to find me a reason why I can litigate this. You need to find a reason that these votes are not legitimate. And I don't care what happens. I don't care if people are upset. Make them riot," right? And so unrest starts outside of these polling places. And then Donald Trump uses that unrest outside of the polling places to then try and claim that that's a part of the fraud, that his own campaign operatives are being kept out of the polling places where they're allowed to be. Now we're on the top of page 9. Contrary to the defendant's public claims of victory immediately following Election Day, his advisors informed him that he would likely lose. Okay, his advisors looked him in the face and said, "You're likely going to lose." On November 7th, in a private campaign meeting that included P2, P3, and P4, which are Bill Stepien, Justin Clark, and Jason Miller, and a White House staffer who is P9, who is Greg Jacob White, they came to serve as a conduit for information from the campaign to the defendant. Campaign staff told the defendant that he only had a slim chance of prevailing in the election and that any potential success was contingent on the defendant winning all ongoing vote counts or litigation in Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin. Right? So imagine this, okay? It is November 7th. They are still counting the mail-in votes, okay? Trump is in the room with his campaign team, right? And they are looking him in the face and they're saying, "Look, it's not looking good. In order for you to win this, you are going to have to win every single vote count that's happening or all of the litigation that's going on in Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin." Okay? Let's get back to the text. Within a week of that assessment, on November 13th, the defendant's campaign conceded its litigation in Arizona, which means they were like, "We lost. We acknowledge that we lost this litigation in Arizona." meaning that based on his campaign advisor's previous assessment, the defendant had lost the election. Right? So at this moment on November 13th, when his campaign is conceding this litigation, that's basically them saying, you lost. The election's over, yo. Back to the text. That same day, in an implicit acknowledgement that he had no lawful way to prevail, the defendant sidelined the existing campaign staff responsible for mounting his legal election challenges, right? So that means he initially had this set of staff who was doing the election challenges, right? But they saw the writing on the wall and they were like, yeah, we lost, right? And after that group of legal operatives conceded and were like, they lost, that same day, okay, Donald Trump sidelined the existing campaign staff who were responsible for those legal challenges, right? So all the lawyers who had just conceded, he was like, y'all can go. We're not doing this anymore, okay? From P2 and P3, remember P2 is Bill Stepien and P3 is Justin Clark, and others who were telling the defendant the truth that he did not want to hear, that he had lost. The defendant turned to co-conspirator number 1, who was Rudy Giuliani, a private attorney who was willing to falsely claim victory and spread knowingly false claims of election fraud. So all of us who remember what happened in 2020, right? When suddenly Rudy Giuliani just came out of nowhere and he was doing all these press conferences and he was sweating and the dye in his hair was like sweating down his face, right? Like he had been brought in after like more legitimate lawyers had been like, we lost, we're not going to win this. So he reaches out to co-conspirator number 1, Rudy Giuliani. All right, we're on the last paragraph on page 9. As the defendant placed alternating phone calls to P3, Justin Clark, and Rudy Giuliani throughout November 13th, P1, Steve Bannon, informed Christina Bobb, another private campaign advisor, of the change, writing, quote, close hold, don't tell anyone, Trump just fired Justin Clark and put Rudy Giuliani in charge, end quote. And, quote, you are to report to Rudy Giuliani. When Christina Bobb asked if P2, who is Bill Stepien, was gone too, okay, Steve Bannon replied that, quote, they all report to Rudy Giuliani, and that Steve Bannon had, quote, made a recommendation directly that if Rudy Giuliani was not in charge, this thing is over. Trump is in it to the end, right? So this is like a smoking pew-pew, you guys, okay? Basically, this outlines and shows like proof and intent, right? That they had legitimate lawyers who were like making legitimate legal claims. And then they were like, we got to concede, we lost. Trump was like, to hell with all that, right? Y'all got to go. All of them are fired. We're bringing in Rudy Giuliani. Right? Steve Bannon was like, bring in Rudy. We are all going to report to him because if he's not in charge, Steve Bannon said, quote, if Rudy Giuliani was not in charge, this thing is over. Trump is in it to the end, meaning he's going to fight these election results. He's going to fight the fact that he lost all the way to the end, right? Let's get back into the text. We're still at the top of page 10. The next day, consistent with Steve Bannon's description, the defendant announced his staff change by tweet, writing, quote, I look forward to Rudy Giuliani spearheading the legal effort to defend, all caps, our right to free and fair elections, right? He names a bunch of other people. Rudy Giuliani, Joseph de Genova, is that how you pronounce his name? Then there's P11, who is Victoria Toensing. And then there's co-conspirator number 3, Sidney Powell. And then P12, who is Jenna Ellis. And he names them as a truly great team. They added to our other wonderful lawyers and representatives. Now, what's so wild is that you can go back through Donald Trump's Twitter feed and see this, right? So Jack Smith is just laying out the progression of events, right? So we have now a legitimate legal team who's conceded. They're like, you lost, buddy. Trump says, fuck all that. I'm bringing my team in. Rudy Giuliani's at the head of this, all right? And the people that I just named. So that's the end of section A. Now we're getting into section B, which is titled, "The defendant knew that his claims of outcome determinative fraud were false." This is the section where Jack Smith lays out evidence that Trump knew, was told, had facts in front of him, and was told that there was no fraud, right? So all of the claims that Trump made about fraud, Jack Smith is saying he knew those were a lie. Let's get into the text. We're back on page 10. Following Election Day and throughout the charged conspiracies, the defendant, his co-conspirators, and their agents spread lies that there had been outcome determinative fraud in the election and that he had actually won. These lies included dozens of specific claims that there had been substantial fraud in certain states, such as that large numbers of unalived, non-resident, non-citizens, or otherwise ineligible voters had cast ballots, or that voting machines had changed votes for the defendant to votes for Biden. And the defendant and co-conspirators continued to make these unsupported, objectively unreasonable, and ever-changing claims, even after they had been publicly disproven or after advisors had directly informed the defendant that they were untrue. The evidence demonstrates that the defendant knew his fraud claims were false because he continued to make those claims even after his close advisors, acting not in an official capacity, but in a private or campaign-related capacity, told him they were not true. These advisors included P9, who is Greg Jacobs, the White House staffer and campaign conduit, and Pence, the defendant's running mate. So what he's basically saying is Mike Pence looked him in his face and was like, all of this is a lie. What are you doing? And he still continued with it. All right. P9, Greg Jacobs' relationship with the defendant began before he worked for him in the White House. Greg Jacobs had known P13, who is Jared Kushner, the defendant's son-in-law, since Jared was a child, and through Jared met P14, who was Ivanka Trump, and then the defendant. P9, again, Greg Jacobs, was one of several attorneys who represented the defendant in his first impeachment trial in the Senate in 2019 and 2020, including presenting argument on the Senate floor on January 27, 2020. Greg began working in the White House as an assistant to the president in August of 2020. In October 2020, Greg became interested in learning more about the defendant's campaign. And in early November 2020, after he began interfacing with campaign staff, Greg consulted with the White House counsel's office, that's like the White House legal's office, to ensure he complied with any applicable laws regarding campaign activity. Thank y'all for all the gifts and stuff. I really appreciate that. Thereafter, and throughout the post-election period, Greg became a conduit of information from the campaign to the defendant. And over the course of the conspiracies, Greg told the defendant the unvarnished truth about his campaign legal team and the claims of fraud that they and the defendant were making. Examples of these instances include, right? So right now, Jack is about to give us all the examples of Greg, who's like a legitimate lawyer, who's like been trying to help out, right? He's coming in here, and these are the pieces of evidence where he looked Trump in his face and was like, yo, you lost the election, babe. You lost the election. First, Greg repeatedly gave the defendant his honest assessment that Rudy Giuliani could not mount successful legal challenges to the election. For instance, when the defendant told Greg that he was going to put Rudy Giuliani in charge of the campaign's legal efforts, but pay him only if he succeeded, Greg told the defendant he would never have to pay Rudy anything. In response, the defendant, Donald Trump, laughed and said, quote, "We'll see." Thereafter, in Oval Office meetings with the defendant, Rudy Giuliani, and others, in which Rudy Giuliani made speculative claims, Greg told Rudy Giuliani in front of the defendant that Rudy Giuliani would be unable to prove his allegations in a courtroom. In a separate private conversation, when Greg reiterated to the defendant that Rudy Giuliani would be unable to prove his false fraud allegations in court, the defendant responded, quote, "The details don't matter." Donald Trump was in the Oval Office with Rudy Giuliani and Greg. Greg looked both of them in the face and was like, the things that you were trying to put up here, these claims that you were making, you're not going to be able to prove this in a courtroom. And Donald Trump said, quote, the details don't matter. The details don't matter. That's footnoted. Okay, they have evidence of this. This is going to come out in an exhibit if this is allowed to go forward. Next, in the post-election period, Greg also took on the role of updating the defendant on a nearly daily basis on the campaign's unsuccessful efforts to support any fraud claims. Greg told the defendant that the campaign was looking into his fraud claims and had even hired external experts to do so, but could find no support for them. He told the defendant that if the campaign took these claims to court, they would get slaughtered because the claims were all, quote, bullshit. That's the quote. The claims are bullshit. Greg was privy in real time to the findings of the 2 expert consulting firms that the campaign retained to investigate the fraud claims. C1, let's see who these people are. Let me go back to my list. Oh, they might not be included here. Okay, well, C1 is some sort of consulting firm, and C2, and discussed with the defendant their debunkings on all major claims. For example, Greg told the defendant that Georgia's audit of the election disproved claims that C3, which is, we'll get to later, Dominion, the voting company who's in charge of the voting machines. I'm sure some of you who were probably deep in the 2020 thing and tracking that can remember all the stuff about Dominion. And then there was that case with Dominion where they were like, hey, you lied on us in public. Like, that's not cool. So basically, this piece of evidence shows us that Greg, who was working with the campaign, okay? The campaign themselves, the Republicans, Trump's team, hired people to investigate the fraud claims themselves. And the people he hired came back and were like, yo, there's no evidence here, babe. There's absolutely no evidence. Not true. Can't find anything to support that. Okay, so again, this is in the section where Jack is claiming, hey, Donald Trump knew that the claims that he was making about fraud were false. He knew that when he was making them. All right, now we're in the middle of page 12. In the post-election time period, Pence, the defendant's own running mate, who he had directed to assess fraud allegations, told the defendant that he had seen no evidence of outcome determinative fraud in the election. Again, this is footnoted. They are likely going to call Mike Pence as a witness if they can, okay? I also want to take a moment here now because this trial is only going to happen if Donald Trump is not elected. Right? In November, if Donald Trump gets elected, he would be the president again, and he would be able to appoint a new attorney general and put new people in charge of the Department of Justice. He could just pardon himself. He can make this case go away. Okay? And that's part of the reason why I think he's running for president now, to stay out of jail. Because they've been working on this, okay, since 2020. All right? He's known that this is coming. Okay? So, but if he loses this election, y'all, we gonna need some popcorn for like February because the trial is gonna be wild. It's gonna be wild. Okay, back to the text. So this was one of the many conversations the defendant and Pence had as running mates in which they discussed their shared electoral interest. Pence gradually and gently tried to convince the defendant to accept the lawful results of the election, even if it meant they lost. These conversations included, all right, now I want you to imagine this as I go through this, right? Pence is sitting there with Trump, who's acting like a petulant child and cannot accept that he lost this election. And Pence is like basically trying to like stroke his narcissistic ego and be like, hey, bud, it's okay. Like maybe next time. So these are the conversations that they had. At the bottom of page 12. A conversation on November 4th. This is the day after the election, okay? Votes are still being counted. In which the defendant asked Pence to, quote, study up claims of voter fraud in states that they had won together in 2016 to determine whether they could bring legal challenges as candidates in those states. Pence described the conversation as follows. This is a direct quote from the then Vice President of the United States. Quote, well, I think it was broadly. It was just look at all of it. Let me know what you think. But he told me that the campaign was going to fight, was going to go to court and make challenges. And then he just said, we're going to fight this and take a look at it. Let me know what you think, end quote. Next conversation between Donald Trump and Pence. A call between the defendant and Pence on November 7th, the day that media organizations began to project Biden as the winner of the election. I wonder if this is the day where we got that clip where Kamala's like, we did it, Joe. Anyway, Pence, quote, tried to encourage the defendant, quote, as a friend, reminding him, you took a dying political party and gave it a new lease on life, end quote. This is Pence trying to talk up Trump. Show him the bright side of this. You know, you might have lost, but you know, you did some good, right? Next conversation. A November 11th meeting among the defendant, Pence, campaign staff, and some White House staff, during which Pence asked when most of the lawsuits would be resolved. Quote, when does this come to a head, end quote. And the campaign staff responded, quote, the week after Thanksgiving, end quote. So that's basically them setting up the timeline, where Pence is sitting there asking, how long are y'all gonna do this? Like, when you gonna let this go, right? And at the time, they were saying the week after Thanksgiving, so like early December. A November 12th meeting among the defendant, Pence, campaign staff, and some White House staff, during which Pence recalls the, quote, campaign lawyers gave a sober and somewhat pessimistic report of the state of the election challenges, end quote. So Pence is in the room here when the campaign lawyers are looking Donald Trump in his face and they're being like, homie, it's gone. You've lost the election, babe. Next conversation. A private lunch on November 16th in which Pence tried to encourage the defendant to accept the results of the election and run again in 2024, to which the defendant responded, quote, I don't know, 2024 is so far off, end quote. Next conversation between Donald Trump and Pence. A November 23rd phone call in which the defendant told Pence that the defendant's private attorney, who is P78, who is that? Oh, P76, we're back at Sidney Powell, was not optimistic about the election challenges, right? So they're on the phone and Donald Trump himself is telling Mike Pence, my lawyer says it's not looking good for us in court. This is November 23rd, okay? They have another conversation on December 21st. It's a private lunch in which Pence, quote, encouraged the defendant to, quote, not to look at the election as a loss, just an intermission, end quote. This was followed later in the day by a private discussion in the Oval Office in which the defendant asked Pence, quote, what do you think we should do, end quote. Pence said, quote, after we have exhausted every legal process in the courts and Congress, if we still came up short, you should take a bow, right? So Pence is trying to be like, listen, once the court thing is over, and if there's any like congressional things, like after all that, you gotta let this go. You just gotta take a bow out, babe. Next conversation. Discussions in which Pence apprised the defendant of conversations he had with governors in Arizona and Georgia in the context of election challenges, in which Pence had called the governors, quote, simply to gather information and share it with the president, end quote, and in which the governors did not report evidence of fraud in the elections in their states and explained that they could not take actions to convene their states' legislatures. Right? So basically, Pence gets on the phone with these governors and the governors report to him, hey, there's no evidence of election fraud here, yo. There's no basis upon which we can convene our state legislatures. And the reason that Trump wanted them to convene their state legislatures was to not certify the results, to throw out Biden's electors, and then say, we're going to put Trump's electors in place. For those of you who were not here in the very beginning, when I was talking about the elector fraud, basically, simply what what happens with the Electoral College is that each state does their own little local election for who the electors will be based on each candidate. So Biden's got a slate and Trump's got a slate. And whoever wins the popular vote in that state, they'll get those electors by and large. There are some outliers like Nebraska and Maine who like separate their electors based on like congressional districts, but most are like winner take all. And so Trump and his team wanted state legislatures to say, Biden's duly elected electors, we're not going to take that list. We're going to take this fake list of the people who would have been duly elected had Trump won, even though he wasn't. All right, we're at the top of page 14. But the defendant disregarded Gregg and Pence in the same way that he disregarded dozens of court decisions that unanimously rejected his and his allies' legal claims, and that he disregarded officials in the targeted states, right? Remember, we're talking about Arizona, Nevada, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, all of those, Georgia as well, including those in his own party. So he's disregarding Republican officials who stated publicly that he had lost and that his specific fraud allegations were false. Okay? All these people, all this mountain of evidence in his face, and he's like, I don't care, right? The details don't matter. Election officials, for instance, issued press releases and other public statements to combat the disinformation that Trump and his allies were spreading. At one point, long after Trump had begun spreading false fraud claims, P15, who is assistant to the president and director of Oval Office operations, Nicholas F. Luna. Also, for those who recently joined, someone took the time to put together a list of the names of the people whose names have been redacted in the document. I'm only reading off the names of like public figures. I'm not going to read any like names of regular people who were just, manning the polls. All right. So that person, Nicholas, a White House staffer traveling with the defendant, overheard Trump tell family members that, quote, it doesn't matter if you won or lost the election. You still have to fight like hell. So now at this point, we're on page 15. All of this like smoking pew-pew evidence. And we've got two pretty big quotes from Trump, right? People looking him in his face saying the evidence that you have is not going to stand up in court. He says the details don't matter. Right? Now, he's overheard telling his family, it doesn't matter if you won or lost the election. You still have to fight like hell, right? This is evidence showing that Trump knew that he was lying about these claims and that he had lost the election. All right, we're still at the top of page 15. The defendant and his co-conspirators also demonstrated their deliberate disregard for the truth and thus their knowledge of falsity when they repeatedly changed the numbers in their baseless fraud allegations from day to day. So this is where Jack is going to take us through like all the different claims that they made. Like they couldn't keep their numbers straight, right? Which shows you these numbers aren't real, right? At trial, the government will introduce several instances of this pattern in which the defendant and co-conspirators' lies were proved by the fact that they made up figures from whole cloth. One example concerns Trump and conspirators' claims about non-citizen voters in Arizona. The conspirators started with the allegation that 36,000 non-citizens voted in Arizona. 5 days later, it was, quote, beyond credulity that a few 100,000 didn't vote, end quote. 3 weeks later, quote, the bare minimum was 40 or 50,000. The reality is about 250,000, end quote. Days after that, the assertion was 32,000. And ultimately, the conspirators landed back where they started at 36,000, a false figure that they never verified or corroborated. So in this sentence or in this paragraph, Jack Smith is basically like, listen, if you let us come to court with this, we're going to put in front of you multiple instances of these people just making up numbers. Making up numbers. Wild. One day it's 36,000. The next day it's 250. Then it's 32,000, right? And then on top of that, it's a false figure that they never verified or corroborated. They can never bring you any facts or figures or anything to justify this. Back to the text. Ultimately, the defendant's steady stream of disinformation in the post-election period culminated in the speech he gave at a privately funded, privately organized rally at the Ellipse on the morning of January 6, 2021, in advance of the official proceedings in which Congress was to certify the election in favor of Biden. Now, for those of you wondering, it's like this sentence here is doing a lot of work. Notice that Jack Smith calls that rally on January 6th. He says it's privately funded. It's privately organized, right? That is to show that Trump was doing that not as the president, not as part of an official act, right, which the Supreme Court says there's immunity for, but as a private citizen who was running for office, right? Not as an office holder, but as a candidate for office, right? That distinction is clear. So he's trying to lay the groundwork to show that they are going to prove that what happened on January 6th and him riling up that crowd was not some sort of official act that he's immune for. In his speech, the defendant repeated the same lies about election fraud in Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin that had been publicly or directly debunked. Remember, this is January 6th at this point, right? And all of the evidence is going to come out. Later in the document, Jack is going to take us state by state, right? And give you a timeline of all of that and how it happens, okay? So, then he says the defendant used these lies to inflame and motivate the large and angry crowd of his supporters to march to the Capitol and disrupt the certification of the proceedings. We're at the top of page 16, and now we're getting into section C, which is titled, "The Defendant Aimed Deceit at the Targeted States to Alter Their Ascertainment and Appointment of Electors." Now, those are just big legal words to basically say Donald Trump was lying specifically about like Arizona, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, Nevada, all of those specific states in order to get them to change who they put up as their list of electors. That's all that means in English. All right. Shortly after Election Day, the defendant began to target the electoral process at the state level by attempting to deceive state officials and to prevent or overturn the legitimate ascertainment and appointment of Biden's electors. Ascertainment and appointment just means we know who those people are, and then they're going to come here and they're going to certify their vote. We're going to put their name in the list. That's what that means. As president, the defendant had no official responsibilities related to the state's administration of the election or the appointment of their electors, and instead contacted state officials in his capacity as a candidate. Remember, Jack is going to continue to talk about this distinction, right? Continue to say he was doing these things as a private citizen, as a candidate, because otherwise it could be an official act and it might be immune. Okay. All right. Tellingly, the defendant contacted only state officials who were in his political party and were his political supporters, and only in states he had lost. The defendant's attempts to use deceit to target the state's electoral process played out in Georgia, Arizona, Michigan, Nevada, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, as well as across these and other states that use certain voting machines. Remember, those are the Dominion machines. In addition to the following evidence of the defendant's conduct during the charged conspiracies, at trial, the government will elicit testimony from election officials from the targeted states to establish the objective falsity and often impossibility of the defendant's fraud claims. This is Jack being like, listen, if you let us go to trial, we're going to bring these election officials up. They're going to get on the stand. They're going to be under oath, and they are going to say there's absolutely no evidence of election fraud. And actually, a lot of the things that Trump is claiming happened are just objectively impossible. Like, it's nonsense. Like, it's not inside of the realm of reality. Okay? Back to the text. Notably, although these election officials would have been the best sources of information to determine whether there was any merit to specific allegations of election fraud in their states, the defendant never contacted any of them to ask, right? That's a note to be like, hey, if you really cared about whether election fraud was going on, wouldn't you just call these people who are closest to it and would know what was going on? All right. Now we're at the top of page 17, And this is where it starts getting juicy, okay? Because now he's about to go state by state, right? And we're going to start with number 1, and it's Arizona is the state that he starts with. And then he's going to give a timeline and detailed evidence of everything that Trump did in each of these states, everything his co-conspirators did in each of these states to try and overturn their election results, all right? So we're at the top of page 17. The defendant was on notice that there was no evidence of widespread election fraud in Arizona within a week of the election. On November 9th, for instance, 2 days after news networks projected that Biden had won, the defendant called the Arizona governor to ask him what was happening at the state level with the presidential vote count in Arizona. At that point, though Fox News had projected that Biden had won the state, several other news outlets, including ABC, NBC, CNN, and the New York Times, had not yet made a projection. The governor walked the defendant through the margins and the votes remaining to be counted, which were primarily from Pima County, which favored Biden, and Maricopa County, which was split. The governor described the situation to the defendant as, quote, the 9th inning, 2 outs, and Trump was several runs down, end quote. The defendant also raised claims of election fraud, and the governor asked the defendant to send him supporting evidence. Although Trump said he would, stating, quote, we're packaging it up, end quote, he never did. Shortly thereafter, on November 13th, the campaign manager, who is P2, let me bring my list back up, that's Bill Stepien. The campaign manager told the defendant directly that a false fraud claim that had been circulating, that a substantial number of non-citizens had voted in Arizona, was false. The same day, as noted previously, campaign attorneys conceded in court that the remaining election lawsuit in Arizona was moot, okay? This is really important. Donald Trump got on the phone with the governor of Arizona, and the governor of Arizona told him, listen, the rest of the votes that are going to come in are from Pima County, which is going to favor Biden by a lot, and then Maricopa County, which is a split. So basically, mathematically, there's not really a way you can come back from this. He says we're in the 9th inning, there's 2 outs, and you are several runs down. You're not coming back from this, okay? The Republican governor of Arizona told Donald Trump this on the phone, okay? So he knows he's lost Arizona. And then he still tries to make these claims, right? Still being like, oh no, there was fraud. And the governor's basically like, okay, bet, Pixar, it didn't happen. Okay, where's the evidence? And Trump's like, oh, we're packaging it up. We're boxing it up right now. But it never comes, okay? He knows he doesn't have the evidence. And then shortly after that, on November 13th, you get the campaign manager, Bill, being like, listen, the fraud claim that we had going around trying to say that non-citizens were voting in Arizona, there's no truth to that. We couldn't find any evidence of that, right? And that is the day where the campaign attorneys, the legitimate ones at the beginning, who were pushed out and then replaced by Rudy Giuliani, that's the day that those legitimate people conceded in court that the remaining election lawsuit in Arizona was moot. So like everybody in his team on like November 13th is like, Arizona's gone, homie. We're at the top of page 18. The defendant and Rudy Giuliani continued to try to influence the Arizona governor. For example, Rudy Giuliani tried to contact the Arizona governor on November 22nd. The same day, the defendant and Rudy Giuliani reached out to the Arizona Speaker of the House, as described below. So they're going to give us some more details in a second. And on November 30th, the day that the Arizona governor signed the Arizona Certificate of Ascertainment, formally declaring Biden's electors as the legitimate electors for Arizona, the governor received a call from Donald Trump and Pence. The governor advised them that Arizona had certified the election. He's like, it's over, baby. When the defendant, Trump, continues to bring up fraud claims, the governor, eager to see the evidence, again asked the defendant to provide it. But the defendant never did, right? So they're on the phone again, and the governor's like, we done certified this, right? We're going to let this go. And Donald Trump is still on the phone being like, lies, lies, lies. And the governor's like, where's the evidence? Okay. But Trump still doesn't have any. Instead, later that evening and into the following morning, the defendant repeatedly publicly attacked the Arizona governor as well as the Georgia governor on Twitter, retweeting posts by others such as, quote, "Who needs Democrats when you have Republicans like the Arizona and Georgia governor?" Watching the Arizona hearings and then watching the Arizona governor sign those papers, why bother voting for Republicans if what you get is the Arizona governor and the Georgia governor, right? The Georgia governor, quote, "My state ran the most corrupt election in American history," is what Trump is tweeting out, right? And then he's like, then the Arizona governor comes behind him and is like, quote, "Hold my beer." These are all things that Trump is tweeting, right? Tweeting at this time. And quote, "Why is the governor of Arizona still pretending he's a member of the Republican Party after he just certified fraudulent election results in Arizona that disenfranchised millions of Republicans?" Now, look, Jack Smith has just laid out for you. Donald Trump and Mike Pence are on the phone with the governor of Arizona. The governor's like, "Yo, we did not find any evidence, right? I've certified the election. It is over here." And what does Trump do? He gets on the internet, gets on Twitter, and literally says, right, he just certified fraudulent election results in Arizona that disenfranchised millions of Republicans, knowingly lying to the American people and ginning up this fear and mistrust of American elections. That's the bottom of page 18. Whew. Okay, I think I'll finish up on page 20 because we're about to get some pretty ridiculous quotes here on page 19 and 20. Top of page 19. The defendant and co-conspirators also attempted to use false fraud claims to convince political allies in the Arizona state legislature to ignore the popular vote and appoint illegitimate electors. On November 22nd, the defendant and Rudy Giuliani called P18, who is the Speaker of the House of the Arizona House of Representatives. Rudy Giuliani did most of the talking. During the call, the defendant and Rudy levied multiple false fraud claims, including of non-citizen, non-resident, and unalived voters that affected the defendant's race, and asked the Speaker of the Arizona House of Representatives to use them as a basis to call the state legislature into session to replace Arizona's legitimate electors with illegitimate ones for the defendant. When the Speaker of the Arizona House of Representatives voiced deep skepticism, Rudy said, quote, "Well, you know, we're all kind of Republicans and we need to work together," end quote. Speaker of the Arizona House of Representatives refused and asked Rudy Giuliani to provide evidence of his to support his fraud claims, and Rudy never did. I do want to take a second and just note the real patriotism of these individuals who are literally being pressured by the sitting president of the United States, right? They're on the phone with him. They are members of his party. And he is like, "Hey, you need to throw this election." And they have the courage and the fortitude to look at him and be like, "You don't have no evidence for that, bro. You don't have no evidence for that." And that is real patriotism right there, okay? Something that in last night's VP debate, JD Vance openly indicated he does not have, and that he's willing to throw an election for Donald Trump. But these individuals, these Republicans who are in office, the governor of Arizona, the Speaker of the Arizona House of Representatives, takes a lot of courage. But remember here, we're getting things where Rudy Giuliani is on the phone with the Speaker of the House where he's like, "Hey, call a session. Let's just put out those electors, and here, take this list of our guys and put that through. And so we will get Arizona's electoral votes. Just do that." And when the Speaker of the House is like, "No, that's crazy. Yo, where's your evidence?" Rudy's just like, "Well, we're all kind of Republicans. We need to be working together." Right? Like, it's wild. All of this is footnoted. Okay, so these people have likely been deposed. They've said this on the record. They are ready to come to a court of law, swear on the Bible, take an oath, and say that this is what happened. All right. Indeed, Rudy met with the Speaker of the Arizona House of Representatives in person approximately a week later and still had nothing to back up his claims, okay? We were just on the phone. And I said, if you got some evidence, bring it. You gonna show up a week later in a meeting with me and have nothing? That's basically what's happening, okay? On November 30th, Rudy Giuliani and P12, who is Jenna Ellis, and others arrived in Arizona for a hotel hearing, which is an unofficial meeting with Republican legislators, during which they promoted false fraud allegations. In a meeting the day after the hearing, when state legislators pressed Rudy and Jenna for evidence to support their claims, Rudy conceded that even on that late date, this is November 30th, quote, "We don't have the evidence, but we have lots of theories," end quote. Rudy Giuliani, November 30th, at a hotel hearing where he's brought all these Republican legislators together, asking them to overthrow the election, right? Talking about all these fraud allegations, right? He's like, we don't have evidence, but we have theories, almost like concepts of a plan. We have concepts of evidence. We've got, theories. What the hell? Okay, bottom of page 19. When the legislators were frustrated that Rudy had no support for his claims and asked him tough questions, Rudy expressed surprise at the way he was being treated, stating, quote, "Man, I thought we were all Republicans. This is a little more hostile a reception. I'm amazed at the reception I'm getting here," end quote. This man thought he was just going to walk into a room of other Republicans and ask them to overturn a free and fair election, and was shook when they were like, "Where is your evidence? What are you doing?" Because all of this is a crime, right? It's wild. And this is why Steve Bannon wanted Rudy Giuliani brought in, right? Because to do this, as an attorney, there are ethics standards, okay? You have to pass the bar. But before you can even be admitted to the bar, you have to pass something called the moral character and fitness test, okay? It's a background check. They go into all of your business, okay? And you have to acknowledge any wrongdoing that you've done. We take ethics classes in law school. There are rules, okay? And the biggest rule is that you cannot just get up in court or bring claims that you know are false, because that harms the legitimacy of our entire legal system, right? It is hard. It is difficult to find a legitimate lawyer who will engage in this kind of nonsense, okay? It's difficult to find them. That's why the legitimate folks, once they ran through all the things that they could stand behind, they were like, well, we just got to concede. We can't win this. And Trump was like, all right, y'all can go. Who can I find who's going to violate all these ethics rules and continue pushing forward, right? Rudy Giuliani was his man. All right, we're at the top of page 20. On December 4th, P18, who is Rusty Bowers. Oh, that's our Arizona House of Representatives, the Speaker of the House there. He released a public statement in which he explained that he did not have the authority to use the legislator to, quote, "to reverse the results of the election," end quote, and that doing so would constitute an attempt, quote, "to nullify the people's vote based on unsupported theories of fraud," end quote, okay? So our Speaker of the House in Arizona is like, listen, I don't have the power to do this. And to do this would nullify votes based on claims of fraud that for which there are no evidence, absolutely no evidence. Then he makes clear that he was disappointed with the legitimate election results because he, quote, "voted for President Trump and worked hard to reelect him," end quote, but would not, quote, "violate current law to change the outcome of a certified election," end quote. On Twitter, Liz Harrington, a campaign staffer who worked with Christina Bobb and attacked the Arizona House of Representatives Speaker for his statement, wrote that he, quote, "is intentionally misleading the people of Arizona to avoid the inevitable," end quote. The defendant, Donald Trump, retweeted that mess, that false post, and praised her, right? So you have a patriot, right? This Arizona Speaker of the House of Representatives, right? Saying, listen, I don't have the power to reverse these election results, even for the candidate that I voted for. Okay, I voted for this guy, right? But I'm not going to violate our law to change the outcome of a certified election. And then Trump's people get on Twitter and are like, oh, he's lying to people to avoid the inevitable. And Trump is like, retweet, retweet, retweet. Nonsense. Bottom of page 20. A month later, just 2 days before January 6th, C2, who is John Eastman, another of the defendant's private attorneys and a co-conspirator, called again the Arizona Speaker of the House and his counsel, and P20, who is Corey Langhofer, and urged the Arizona Speaker of the House one last time to use the legislature to decertify Arizona's legitimate electors and overturn the ballot election results. Okay, so again, after they've gone through all of this, he said, I'm not going to do it. We are 2 days ahead of January 6th, and they are calling him again, saying, please overturn the election results. When the Arizona Speaker of the House tells John Eastman that there was no evidence of substantial fraud in Arizona and that he could not legally call the legislature into session, John Eastman was undeterred. He conceded that he, quote, didn't know enough about the facts on the ground regarding fraud in Arizona, and said that the Arizona Speaker of the House should nonetheless falsely claim that he had the authority to convene the legislature and, quote, let the courts sort it out. But again, this patriot, the Arizona Speaker of the House of Representatives, refuses. I want to pause here because this whole, just send it back to the states and let the courts sort it out. I don't know if you all have seen, there was a recent video that emerged of JD Vance saying that that is what he would have done, right? They asked him, would you have like certified the election results if you were VP? And he was like, I would have, sent the 2 slates of electors back to the states and let them sort it out. That is election interference. That is overturning the election results, okay? This patriot here said, I'm not going to do that. And JD Vance is like, oh, no, that's my shit. I'm ready to do that on day one. We're at the top of page 21. In the post-election period, this Arizona Speaker of the House was harassed. On several occasions, individuals gathered outside of his home with bullhorns and screamed and honked their vehicle horns to create noise. Once, an individual in visible possession of a pistol and wearing a t-shirt in support of a militia group came onto that man's property and screamed at him. At the time of these events, the Arizona Speaker of the House's daughter was at home and was very ill, and the noise called her, quote, disruption and angst. That is the end of the section on Arizona. So as we reflect on that, what we've got is they tried to call the governor of Arizona and be like, overturn these results. And the governor was like, you got some evidence that something went on? Because we haven't found anything, right? Donald Trump is on the phone with him and he's like, we're packaging it up right now. We'll send that over to you right now. Never comes. They don't have it, okay? Then you've got Rudy Giuliani in front of a group of Arizona legislators, and he's like, we don't really have any evidence, but we've got theories of fraud right now. And then you've got them on the phone bullying multiple times the Speaker of the House of the Arizona State House of Representatives, right? Multiple times. Ginning up violence against him. People came to his home because of what Donald Trump was tweeting out. Okay, that's what happened in Arizona. Now we're on page 22 or 21, sorry, and we're on section 2 and we're getting into Georgia. What is my phone battery looking like? Okay, I think we'll get through Georgia and then I'll let y'all go to sleep and I'll come back tomorrow and we'll keep going. All right, Georgia. The defendant had early noticed that his claims of election fraud in Georgia were false. Around mid-November, campaign advisor, who is P4, who is that? Jason Miller, told Donald Trump that his claim that a large number of unalived people had voted in Georgia was false. Okay? He's told this in mid-November. Trump continued to press the claim anyway, including in a press appearance on November 29th, when he suggested that a large enough number of unalived voters had cast ballots to change the outcome of the election in Georgia. Remember, this is the section of Jack Smith's claims where he's like, Trump knew all along that his claims of fraud were false. right? So that's what we're tracking when he's putting out this evidence for each of these states. Okay. 4 days later, on December 3rd, Rudy Giuliani orchestrated a presentation to a judiciary subcommittee of the Georgia State Senate. In the morning, in advance of it, Rudy had spoken to Donald Trump on the phone for almost 20 minutes. And at the hearing, Rudy arranged for co-conspirators and agents to repeat the false unalived voter claim. The claim was so patently false that everyone around Trump knew it. During the hearing, his chief of staff, who is P21, Mark Meadows, and P9, who is George Jacobs White, remember him? George was the one who's been telling him all along at the very beginning, yo, all these claims are garbage. So the chief of staff, Mark Meadows, and George are exchanging text messages on their personal phones, confirming that a campaign attorney, P22, Brad Raffensperger, had verified that Rudy's claim of more than 10,000 unalived voters was false, and that the actual number was around 12 and cannot be outcome determinative. Okay, they are at this judiciary subcommittee hearing, right, that Rudy has called. Okay, and they are sitting there sending texts back and forth, okay, being like, I already confirmed with the attorney that all these claims are false. They actually looked into it. They looked into it, and it was not 10,000 unalived voters. It was only 12, right? Which is, again, takes us back to the thing, yes, on some level, these things are happening, but not at a level that they are outcome determinative, right? These 12 votes are not the 11,780 votes that Trump was calling Georgia to look for, right? Just didn't happen, right? It's not enough. During the subcommittee hearing, the conspirators also set in motion a sensational and dangerous lie about election workers at State Farm Arena that would result in the defendant's supporters harassing and threatening these workers. I don't know if you all are familiar with this, but it was 2 African-American women who were working there. They filed, they actually brought a claim of libel against Rudy Giuliani for the things that are going to be claimed here, and they won it. Right? And Rudy Giuliani owes them millions of dollars, which is why he is on the verge of bankruptcy. All right, but back into the text. So first, P23, who is actually, Peta, what's her name? P23? Clayton Mitchell. One of the defendant's private attorneys claimed that more than 10,000 unalived people had voted in Georgia. Next, P24, Jackie Pick, an agent of the defendant, played misleading excerpts of closed-circuit camera footage from State Farm Arena and insinuated that it showed election workers committing misconduct, counting suitcases of illegal ballots. Lastly, based on false fraud allegations, co-conspirator number 2, John Eastman, who had already been engaged as a private lawyer for Donald Trump, but did not disclose that at the hearing, right? This is an ethics violation, all right? If you were at a hearing and you were there representing someone in a legal capacity, you have to disclose that, right? He doesn't. They encouraged the Georgia legislators to decertify the state's legitimate electors. Again, this video and their testimony around the State Farm Arena, you can see all of that in the documentary on HBO called Stopping the Steal, if you really want to get an inside look into some of this evidence. All right, down at the bottom of page 22. While the hearing was ongoing, the defendant simultaneously amplified the misinformation about the State Farm Arena election workers, falsely tweeting, quote, "Wow, blockbuster testimony taking place right now in Georgia. Ballot stuffing by Dems when Republicans were forced to leave the large counting room. Plenty more coming, but this alone leads to an easy win of the state, exclamation point," end quote. He did this just after retweeting 2 of his campaign account's tweets that promoted the false claim about election workers at State Farm Arena. All right. Now, what we know about the State Farm Arena video, which Jack touches on just a little bit, is that none of it was fraudulent. So they had thought that they were ending counting the ballots that night. And so everybody was packing up to go home, which is why you sort of see in the video that people will pack up and leave. But then they get a notification from the state that actually no, they want people to keep counting. And so that's why they come back. And they're just grabbing like the actual the things that ballots are always kept in, and then they just start going about the process again. And election officials who watch those videos were like, no, this is the way that's done. All right, over the next week, the claim of misconduct at State Farm Arena was disproven publicly as well as directly to Donald Trump. The day after the hearing, P25, who is Gabriel Sterling, the chief operating officer of the Georgia Secretary of State's office, posted a tweet explaining that Secretary of State officers had watched the video in its entirety and confirmed that it showed, quote, normal ballot processing. Gabriel Sterling again forcefully debunked the conspirators' claim about the State Farm video in a press conference on December 7th, explaining at length the election workers' innocent conduct depicted in the closed circuit camera footage and stating, quote, this is a block quote from, what's his position again? He's the he's the chief operating officer of the Georgia Secretary of State's office, right? So he's the guy who's like the deepest into like election certification. Usually you wouldn't hear his name because this stuff is just like normal, right? And so he's the one who like runs and oversees that process. He says this about the closed circuit camera footage. And what's really frustrating is the president's attorneys had this same videotape. They saw the exact same things the rest of us could see, and they chose to mislead state senators and the public about what was on that video. I'm quite sure that they will not characterize the video if they try to enter it into evidence, because that's the kind of thing that could lead to sanctions because it is obviously untrue. They knew it was untrue, and they continue to do things like this. Right? So you've got this officer of the Secretary of State's office basically like giving you the legal lowdown. He's like, they're looking at this video and they know that this is like innocent behavior, and they can't bring this video into an actual court of law and make these claims because it is objectively false. It is objectively false. And as I was telling you earlier, lawyers have an obligation to not knowingly bring false claims. If you do that, you could be disbarred and your case will be thrown out, right? It's just not something that is done. We have ethical standards. On December 8th, the defendant called Georgia Attorney General, and that individual had advance notice that the topic of the call was going to be Texas versus Pennsylvania, which was an election lawsuit where Texas was suing other states, including Georgia, to attempt to prevent the certification of the election, because apparently there were some people in Texas who are not as noble as these other folks who are trying to abide by the actual law. U.S. Senator P27, what's his name? David Perdue, told P26, Georgia Attorney General, his name is Chris, that the defendant had heard that the Georgia Attorney General was whipping or lobbying other state attorney generals against filing amicus briefs in support of Texas. Okay, so what this means is Texas is out here trying to sue other states, including Georgia, right, to try and attempt to prevent the certification of the election. Now, there's a U.S. Senator and the Attorney General of Georgia. And the Attorney General of Georgia is calling up other state attorneys generals, right? So it's the Attorney General in a state that would be the one that would be suing these other states, right? They're the ones who do that. So this specific Attorney General is calling other Attorney Generals, telling them, hey, do not sign on in support of what Texas is doing. Don't do that, okay? Because P26, Georgia's Attorney General, again, his name is Chris, he was not lobbying against the suit and told, who is this P27? P27 is, again, this U.S. Senator. Y'all excuse me, it's hard to go back and forth. David Perdue. And then asked the Georgia Attorney General if he would speak with Donald Trump about it, right? And the Attorney General was like, cool, I'll talk to him. Shortly thereafter, the defendant, Donald Trump, calls this attorney general and immediately raises this Texas versus Pennsylvania case, right? And he says, quote, I hope you're, this is Donald Trump speaking. He says, quote, I hope you're not talking to your AGs and encouraging them not to get on the lawsuit. Imagine this, being called by the sitting president of the United States, who's telling you, I know what you've been doing. I know you've been calling these other attorney generals, trying to get them to not sign on to this fraudulent lawsuit from Texas to intimidate other states to overturn their election results. And he says, quote, I hope you're not talking to your attorney generals and encouraging them not to get on the suit. The AG then tells Donald Trump that he was not affirmatively calling other state attorneys general, but that if they called him, he was telling them what he was seeing in his state, which was something that Trump probably did not want to hear, right? And the AG says he was just not seeing evidence of fraud in Georgia. So in response to Donald Trump being like, I hope you're not talking to these other people, encouraging them not to get on the lawsuit, this AG is like, hey, I'm not actively calling other people. Like, I'm not doing that proactively. But if they call me and ask, I'm telling them I don't see no evidence of fraud in Georgia. Like, that's not going on over here. Donald Trump nonetheless raised various fraud claims. The Attorney General of Georgia told him that the state authorities had investigated the State Farm Arena allegations, that video where they were like, they're pulling out suitcases of ballots and doing all of this stuff with the Republicans out of the room, that video. So he's telling him that the state authorities have investigated that State Farm Arena allegations and they found no wrongdoing, okay? Authorities in the state have investigated it. These aren't just random claims. They've investigated it, they've done the work, and they found no wrongdoing. And that he thought another claim that Trump raised about Coffee County, Georgia, had been similarly resolved, but with check. Donald Trump then asked the Attorney General to look at them again, quote, because we're running out of time. So the AG is on the phone with him and he's like, I haven't seen any evidence of fraud. The state authorities have done their investigation. There's no evidence of that. I feel like this thing you're bringing up now has also been resolved, but I guess I'll check that for you. And Donald Trump is like, look at all of it again, quote, because we're running out of time. The AG tried to steer the call to an end by thanking Donald Trump and telling him that he had voted for him twice and appreciated Trump. To which Trump responded, quote, yeah, I did a hell of a job, didn't I? The arrogance of it. The arrogance of it. Okay. At one point, Trump raised with the AG the impending runoff election for Georgia's U.S. Senate seats. Y'all remember Raphael Warnock and Senator Ossoff, they were running in their runoff elections at this point. And how it was important to reelect P27 David Perdue and P28 Senator Kelly Loeffler. The day after the call, Donald Trump, in his private capacity as a candidate for president, intervened in support of that Texas versus Pennsylvania lawsuit. Okay, his attorney for that matter was John Eastman. So on the same day as the defendant's call with our previous AG, right, the defendants, Donald Trump's campaign staff acknowledged that the State Farm Arena claim, right, the claim about that video and people doing like false election stuff was unsupported, emailing one another about the fact that television networks may decline to run campaign advertisements promoting it, right? They've got emails of his campaign staff going back and forth being like, yo, that these State Farm claims he's making about these black ladies in Georgia stuffing ballots are just not true. Like, it's so blatantly false that like these news organizations, television networks might not even like run any ads, any campaign ads that we try and put out trying to promote that. Like, it's that big of a lie. In frustration regarding the claim and others like it, P4, Jason Miller, who spoke with Donald Trump on a daily basis and had informed him on multiple occasions that various fraud claims were false, wrote, quote, When our research and campaign legal team can't back up any of the claims made by our elite strike force legal team, you can see why we're 0 to 32 on our cases. I'll obviously hustle to help on all fronts, but it's tough to own any of this when it's all just conspiracy shit beamed down from the mothership. That is a direct quote, okay, from P4, who is Jason Miller. This is a senior campaign official, okay, writing in an email that says when our research as the campaign and our campaign legal team, our lawyers, they cannot back up any of the claims that are being made by Rudy Giuliani and his like weird crew that they're calling the elite strike force legal team. Says you can see why we're 0 to 32. We've lost all 32 of these cases. And he's like, I guess I'll hustle to like continue helping, but quote, it's tough to own any of this when it's all just conspiracy shit beamed down from the mothership. That is a quote. Conspiracy shit beamed down from the mothership. They know all of this shit is a lie. They know it is. And they're typing, these are emails. Like it's written, okay? Receipts, timelines. It's disgusting. Okay, I hope everybody gets disbarred. All right, middle of page 25. On December 10th, however, Rudy Giuliani further perpetuated the false State Farm Arena claim, okay? Let me see if I can go back and get the date. So on the same day of his call with the Attorney General, which they said was, wow, the scrolling, December 8th. Okay, December 8th, he has this call with the Attorney General. On the same day, they're sending these emails back and forth being like, this is some conspiracy shit. And I really want to know what the MAGA people feel hearing this kind of thing. When you know that your own candidate that you've supported, especially those people who were at the Capitol on J6, to see this, that they knew, quote, conspiracy shit beamed down from the mothership. Like these people are lying to you. My God. Okay, on December 10th. However, so this is 2 days later, Rudy Giuliani further perpetuated the false State Farm Arena claim when he appeared at another hearing, this one before the Georgia House of Representatives Government Affairs Committee. During it, he displayed some of the same footage as had been used in the December 3rd hearing that had been debunked in the interim by Georgia officials, and nonetheless claimed that it showed, quote, voter fraud right in the eyes of the people, unquote. So they've debunked this. They know there are emails going around saying this is conspiracy shit, and Rudy Giuliani is still in front of the Georgia House of Representatives showing these videos saying it's voter fraud. He then named 2 election workers, right? The 2 black women that I was talking about earlier, I'm not going to name them now, and baselessly accused them of, quote, quite obviously, surreptitiously passing around USB ports as if they are vials of heroin or cocaine. And the racial dog whistles there are wild, okay? And suggested that they were criminals whose, quote, places of work, their homes, should have been searched for evidence of ballots, for evidence of USB ports, for evidence of voter fraud, end quote. The viciousness. I'm not surprised this man got sued and lost and now owes these women millions of dollars to know that that is false and to get up there and say that their homes need to be searched and they were in there like surreptitiously passing around USB ports like it was drugs. It's too much. As these false claims about those women spread, the women were barraged by racist death threats. In the years since, they have spoken about the effect of Donald Trump and co-conspirators' lies about them. As one of the women explained in an interview with congressional investigators, quote, when someone as powerful as the President of the United States eggs on a mob, that mob will come. They came for us with their cruelty, their threats, their racism, and their hats. They haven't stopped. Even today, end quote. Indeed, to this day, the defendant has never stopped falsely attacking those women. Although none of the false claims against them were ever corroborated, the defendant has continued to levy them on social media, including when the defendant attacked one of those women in January of 2023, 2023. Just after her testimony to congressional investigators was made public. He's still doing it till this day. Yes, held liable, not convicted, but yes. Thank you for that note. Middle of page 26. Throughout the post-election period, the defendant used Twitter to publicly attack Georgia governor. Is this Brian Kemp? Yeah, P17 is Brian Kemp, with particular aggression. In the 35 days between November 30th, 2020 and January 3rd, 2021, Donald Trump tweeted critically about Brian Kemp by name or title more than 40 times. Okay, Twitter fingers. These tweets included the ones also attacking P16, the Arizona governor, Doug Ducey, described above, as well as others particular to Brian Kemp. Oh, what is that? Okay. Like, quote, why won't Governor Brian Kemp, the hapless governor of Georgia, use his emergency powers, which can be easily done, to overrule his obstinate Secretary of State and do a match of signatures on envelopes? It will be a gold mine of fraud, and we will win the state. Quote, I will easily and quickly win Georgia if Governor Brian Kemp or the Secretary of State permit a simple signature verification. Has not been done and will show large-scale discrepancies. Why are these two Republicans saying no? If we win Georgia, everything else falls into place. These are his tweets. Okay. The Republican governor of Georgia refuses to do signature verification, which would give us an easy win. What's wrong with this guy? What is he hiding? And another tweet, how does Governor Brian Kemp allow certification of votes without verifying signatures, and despite the recently released tape of ballots being stuffed? Again, referencing the State Farm video that has by this point been clearly debunked. His poll numbers have dropped like a rock. He is finished as governor. In the post-election period, the defendant also made false claims in court about fraud in Georgia, unsuccessfully. Right? So now he's about to go through the claims that they brought in court in Georgia that did not go well. For example, in Trump v. Kemp, which is the name of the case, a federal lawsuit in which the defendant, Donald Trump, sued Georgia's governor and Secretary of State. The defendant signed a verification of fraud allegations that he and his attorney on the case, John Eastman, knew was inaccurate. And I'm going to pause right now because that action alone is worthy of jail time. That action alone right there can get you caught up legally, okay? Signing a verification of allegations that you know to be false. P9, this is Greg again. Now, Greg's the guy who's trying to be on the up and up and telling him the whole time, this is not legit, yo. He speaks with the defendant and John Eastman in late December regarding this proposed verification, regarding this legal document that they're gonna sign and say, we verify that that we have evidence that these fraud allegations are real, okay? First, he told John Eastman, Greg told John Eastman and another private attorney, P31, who is Kurt Hilbert, that they could not have the defendant sign it because they could not verify any of the facts. Again, Greg is on the up and up. He's trying to tell them the law here. And Greg's like, you cannot have Donald Trump sign that. You can't have him sign that because you can't verify those facts. Like, that's against the law. And Greg told Donald Trump that any lawyer that signed the complaint that the verification supported would get disbarred. Disbarred, okay? Because it is illegal. It is a violation of legal ethics. You will lose your license, okay? And that's a lot to do. After paying for law school, after studying for the bar, taking the bar, doing the moral character and fitness test, it's wild to get disbarred over signing a document for something that you know is like not true. Like, that's not something you want to do. John Eastman acknowledged this problem in an email on December 31st. So the lawyer working with Donald Trump acknowledges what Greg says, that we cannot have Donald Trump signing this document or any lawyer doing that because you will get disbarred. He acknowledges that to the lead counsel, the lead attorney for Donald Trump, okay, as when he was a candidate in this Trump v. Kemp case, and another private attorney. And he writes that in the time since Donald Trump signed a previous verification in the case that, quote, he had been made aware that some of the allegations and evidence proffered by experts has been inaccurate, and that signing a new affirmation, quote, with that knowledge and incorporation by reference would not be accurate. Nonetheless, on December 31st, Donald Trump signed the verification and John Eastman caused it to be filed. This alone is a case. This alone. This one paragraph on page 27 is a case by itself, okay? They signed a verification of some fraud allegations that they knew to be false at the time. They put their name on it, certifying this is real, and then sent it to a court. That is illegal. People can lose their law licenses behind that. That this man is even allowed to run for president after something like this is absolutely wild. Thank you so much, Tisha, for the gift. We're on the top of page 28. On January 2nd, Georgia's Secretary of State, P33, who is Brad Raffensperger, appears on Fox News and said that various rumors of election fraud were false and the defendant had lost in Georgia. Right? So you've got the Georgia Secretary of State, again, the people who run elections and certify them in Georgia, right? They're like, oh, FK 2020, thank you. They're like, our office has been very busy with what I call the rumor whack-a-mole. Every day a rumor will pop up and then we whack it down. What we do is we basically whack it down with the truth. And people can't handle the truth sometimes because they're very disappointed in the results. And I get that. I voted for President Trump also, but at the end of the day, we did everything we could. We did an audit of the race. President Trump still lost. Then we did a full recount. President Trump still lost. We had a safe, secure process. This is the Georgia Secretary of State who has voted for Donald Trump twice, wants him to win, is a Republican, and he's telling everybody, listen, we did a recount. We've counted the votes multiple times. He lost. Get over it. Let it go. It's too much. All right, P33, who is Brad Raffensperger, like P17, who is Brian Kemp, has been on the receiving end of Donald Trump's tweets. These included, quote, why is it the Georgia Secretary of State has been on the receiving end of Donald Trump's tweets? These included, quote, why is it the Georgia Secretary of State has been on the receiving end of Donald Trump's tweets? These included, quote, why is it the Georgia Secretary of State, a so-called Republican, allowing us to... Rizwan? Hi, Riz. Oh, I don't understand that. This is my first so-called Republican, allowing us to... Rizwan? Hi, Riz. Oh, I don't understand that. This is my first time doing this, so send a message down at the bottom, but I'm not in a space to co-host. I'm going to be finishing this in just a little bit. All right, I'm doing this, so send a message down at the bottom, but I'm not in a space to co-host. I'm going to be finishing this in just a little bit. All right, I'm doing this, so send a message down at the bottom, but I'm not in a space to co-host. I'm going to be finishing this in just a little bit. All right. We will find tens of thousands of fraudulent and illegal votes. Actually, no, let me start back up at the beginning of his tweet. So Donald Trump says, oh, have I lost connection? Can you all still see me? Okay, great. I think we're still doing well. So Donald Trump says in this tweet, why isn't the Georgia Secretary of State, a so-called Republican, allowing us to look at signatures on envelopes for verification? We will find tens of thousands of fraudulent and illegal votes. Rhinos, Republicans in name only. He names them again. And Secretary of State names them again. Will be solely responsible for the potential loss of our two great senators from Georgia. Remember those two senators earlier who eventually lost to Senator Warnock and Senator Art Ossoff. Won't call a special session or check for signature verification. People are angry in all caps. And, quote, Georgia, where is signature verification approval? What do you have to lose? Move quickly. And again, he's like adding the Georgia Secretary of State. Shortly after seeing the interview, where the Secretary of State gets up and it's like, listen, he lost. I wanted him to win. We counted these votes twice. Let it go. Shortly after seeing this interview, Donald Trump sets up a call with P33, Brad Raffensperger, who is the Secretary of State. So he sees him on television and then he sets up a call to discuss his pending private lawsuit, that Trump versus Kemp, where he's like fighting it in the courts in Georgia, in which, right, the Secretary of State is named as a defendant. So Trump is basically suing this man too, suing him and Brian Kemp, the governor. For this reason, the Secretary of State at first hoped to avoid speaking with Donald Trump, right? Because it's like, hey, we're in the middle of some litigation. I'm a defendant here. You're suing me. Can we not talk? But ultimately acquiesced because Donald Trump was persistent in seeking to set it up. Also, because of the pending lawsuit, this Georgia Secretary of State arranged for his lawyer, his general counsel, P35, I won't name him, to participate. Joining Donald Trump on the call were his chief of staff, again, that's P21, Mark Meadows, and 3 private attorneys. They are P32, which is Ray Smith III, and P36, who is Robert Cheeley, who is the counsel of record in Trump v. Kemp. And the attorneys whom John Eastman had emailed about Donald Trump's false verification, right? Remember what I said earlier, the document he signed that he shouldn't have, that's illegal. And then there's P31, who is this Kurt Hilbert, and P21, Mark Meadows, introduced on the call as